Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Amanda Bradbury. I'm assistant professor in equine science at Montana State University in the Department of Animal and Range Science, and I'm also a consulting nutritionist for Full Bucket Health. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about digestible energy, what it means, what information it gives us, how it can be a little bit confusing, and even some limitations that it gives for us listed on a feed tag, and other considerations that we should take when selecting the energy type in our horses' feeds for different stages of life. So, digestible energy is simply the amount of energy in the diet that can actually be absorbed by the horse. So, it's a part of what we call, as nutritionists, the energy partitioning system. So, energy is supplied in the feed. So, the total amount of energy in a horse's feed we call gross energy. Now, digestible energy accounts for the amount of energy that's going to be lost in the feces. So, dietary absorption through the GI tract is actually never 100%, which is kind of unfortunate, right? You want everything that you feed a horse to be 100% digestible, but it's just not. So digestible energy actually accounts for the energy that we expect to be lost in the digestion process, because the GI is only so efficient. So we can actually determine that by doing what we call bomb calorimetry. So we take the diet of the horse and we put it in this bomb calorimeter, which is basically a fancy machine that has a water containment system around it. You put the feed in the middle of this kind of water containment situation, and you actually light it on fire, which is the bomb portion of it. It sounds way cooler than it actually is. And then you measure the change in water temperature, and that can actually tell you how much energy is in the feed, and we determine that in what we call calories. So I'm sure you are very familiar with calories in your own diet. Calories in the human diet are actually in the form of kilocalories, whereas we kind of jump to a little bit of a different scale with horses up to megacalories. So we can then determine the digestible energy by having our gross energy through bomb calorimetry, and then we can take manure samples from our horses and do the same exact thing. So we know what diet we're feeding the horses, we know the gross energy in that diet. We can then take a sample of that horse's feces, perform the same bomb calorimetry laboratory procedure, and determine the amount of energy that's been excreted from their digestive system, and then we have digestible energy of that diet. So basically all we're accounting for is the amount of energy in that diet that's not going to be absorbed by the horse. And of course, there's going to be some individual variability there, but we have a pretty good idea of what that actually looks like now through a lot of different studies, and feed companies performing this on their own feeds and formulations and so on. So we can actually then take that digestible energy and have a good idea of how much of that feed will actually be absorbed and what is beneficial to the horse. Now, once energy is absorbed, there are other losses of that energy. Just because it's been absorbed doesn't mean that 100% of the energy is going to be metabolized perfectly to only make energy. We have other losses, as you can imagine, through urine, which is another waste loss system in our bodies and in horses' bodies as well. So we do have urine loss. We also have losses in the form of gas, which you may actually be more familiar with if you pay attention to some of the environmental science type things, saying that cattle release methane and carbon dioxide and all of these things that are bad for the environment. Horses release gas too, and that is also considered a potential energy loss. And so that brings us from digestible energy through the loss of urine and gas to metabolizable energy. And then we also lose energy in the form of heat as well. Heat is a byproduct of energy metabolism, and that takes us to net energy. Other livestock species have gone much further in determining energy requirements, all the way down to net energy or even metabolizable energy. Unfortunately, we haven't quite made it that far in our equine industry. We're still at digestible energy, but at least it's something better than just gross energy. We have an idea of the energy that's going to be absorbed by our horses, that's then going to become available for them to metabolize and use as a source of energy. Now, we determine the horse's digestible energy requirements based off of what we know about their maintenance requirements. So we always just add on to what we know those maintenance requirements be, whether it be a mare in gestation or different stages of lactation. We even have horses in different growth stages. So foals are obviously going to have a different digestible energy requirement than even our yearling horses, even though they're both still growing. And then we have our performance events, and those are a little bit more challenging as far as determining what those requirements are, because it's relative to the intensity and the duration of our performance events. Duration, obviously, we can easily determine, but the intensity is what becomes challenging to determine as far as determining digestible energy or assigning digestible energy requirements, because that is based on the fitness of the horse itself, but it's also based off of how we perform different events. So obviously the intensity of a quarter horse racehorse, a barrel racer, a thoroughbred racehorse is going to be different than some of our like Western pleasure or hunt seat type horses. So that's where it becomes a little bit challenging for us on the nutritionist end to determine those digestible energy requirements. Now, one of the downfalls of digestible energy on a feed tag is that it doesn't tell you where the energy actually comes from. So energy can be supplemented in the form of fats or carbohydrates. And then those carbohydrates can be further subdivided into what you'll see on a feed tag as crude fiber, or non-structural carbohydrates, which may be listed as NSC on a feed tag or may not be listed at all. Non-structural carbohydrates, which are our starches and sugars, aren't actually required to be on a feed tag. So crude fiber and crude fat are, which we can then kind of extrapolate how much starch or sugar or those non-structural carbohydrates are in a diet by knowing the other two main components of our energy system. So that's a significant downfall of just looking at digestible energy, because all it tells you is how much energy in that diet is going to be absorbed, but it doesn't tell you what type of energy nutrient is going to be absorbed. So that's where we want to break down that feed tag a little bit further and not just look at digestible energy as megacals per pound or however it may be listed on that feed tag. We want to look a little bit further at some other things that are listed on that tag, such as crude fiber and crude fat, which will give us an idea of how much starch is in that diet. Now, starch is not a bad thing. It shouldn't be considered a four-letter word, which is kind of what we've made it in past years. But it's important to know what is best for your horse for different stages of life. So for example, if I have a racehorse, definitely starch in the diet is going to be necessary. It's going to be important to replenish those glycogen stores that they're going to deplete during their performance events. But if I have a horse that never really crosses that anaerobic threshold to a certain level of intensity that requires starch and sugars in the diet, then I can get that energy from other places in the form of fat or fiber. So that's where we can look at our feed tags and see where that energy is coming from. So we know how much energy is in the diet, which is going to be about the same relative to protein in the diet. So if you have two different 14% crude protein feeds, those two feeds are going to have the same amount of digestible energy between the two of them. So that's kind of nice. It makes it a little bit easier for us to determine how much energy is in the diet. Because if you have two 10% feeds, those two feeds are going to have the same amount of digestible energy, because we always keep protein and energy in a what we call nutrient to calorie ratio. That stays the same, only changes for our mares in gestation, lactation foals. So with that said, we can go down and look at our crude fiber and crude fat content. So if you're comparing two, let's say 10% crude protein feeds that have the same amount of digestible energy in them, then I go look at fiber and fat. Well, one of them is really high in fiber and fat. The other one seems kind of low in fiber and fat. Well, the one that's low in fiber and fat, we know has the same amount of energy as this other feed, but our non-structural carbohydrates aren't listed. So because our fiber and fat, which are 2 out of our 3 energy sources, are low, we know then that most of our energy is going to come from those non-structural carbohydrates. Whereas in our diet, that's still 10% crude protein, still same amount of digestible energy in the diet, has higher levels of fiber and fat, then we can then determine that starch in that diet is going to be fairly low, and you can then make a decision on what's best for your horse based off of their performance needs, maintenance energy requirements, and so on. So just a little way of breaking down digestible energy to determine where the energy is actually coming from in the diet, which is equally as important as selecting a feed that has the appropriate amount of digestible energy in it. Knowing where that energy comes from can be very important. So digestible energy can be kind of a confusing concept in some ways, but basically just big takeaway points from this is that digestible energy is the amount of energy in that feed that can actually be absorbed by the horse. So that's nice for us, but the challenging part is determining where that energy comes from. And that's where we can dig a little bit deeper into that feed tag, where if there's high fiber and fat, there's probably not a whole lot of our non-structural carbohydrates in the form of energy. Whereas if we have low crude fiber and fat percentages in a similar feed, then we probably have more of that energy coming from starch. So we can use that digestible energy amount and then dig a little bit deeper in that feed tag to determine where that's coming from. So that's just a quick little summary on digestible energy and what it means. Check out Full Bucket for all of your horse supplement and digestion needs. Thank you.